Well, hello everyone. Uh, Welcome to the live stream. How are you doing today, Jama?
I'm doing pretty good.
That's good. I just want to quickly out of the way. I just want to thank my patron, $5 plus MP58364, and all the other patrons. This is how I make the shit. I just do it in HTML, by the way. So I was actually just adding my newest one. So anyway, so we're gonna be talking today about our guy, Charles Sanders Peirce. So, yeah. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I had just enough tequila soda to make this especially compelling, so it's going to be pretty awesome, I have to say. All right, so I go on a lot about Peirce in various places and in various ways, and one of the main things that I've talked about on President Sunday's streams and elsewhere, which immediately locates me in the political world of YouTube, has been on kind of the pragmatic maxim. And so Charles Sanders Peirce is a philosopher of science. He's also a metaphysician. He's also, as it turns out, a mathematician. And his legacy is basically established by having come up with a method of inquiry that doesn't dispense with the nature of being and what things are, while simultaneously forcing us not to go from authority in our conceptions of things. And so his original, the way he approaches reality and the way he approaches scientific or philosophical inquiry is what has come to be known in the American Academy as pragmatism. And pragmatism is kind of the third grade of clarity of thinking. Again, this in some previous videos. The first grade of clarity of thinking is, when you think you know something, you don't really know what you're actually talking about, but you have kind of a baseline familiarity with it. So you're going off of these sort of intuitions that you're framing as rational, but they're actually not rational at all. The second grade of clarity is basically math. And so when you're able to deduce something using a proof, you assume that what you're doing is sort of like a novel, is novel and is critical and is considered, but a lot of background conditions go into how we understand mathematical reality. And when we're actually deducing something in a proof, we're often going from authority. We know what factually obtains, so we're just going to plug in the numbers, plug in the values, not like really critically think about forming things from the ground up. And Dilvany is like mathematically pretty damn brilliant, so she's going to, and she knows her economics, so she's going to be going in and showing how Peirce is actually kind of way ahead of his time in terms of his thinking about mathematical forms and norms, and he engages in inquiry in relation to those things as well, instead of just kind of regurgitating proofs, as a lot of people do when they're trying to determine on things in the world. So over his lifetime, he manages to work on this pragmatic maxim, which is the third grade of clarity, and which evaluates things according to their causal effect in the world. So you're not going by any kind of authority. You're not looking at mathematical deductions and just plugging in values. You're not going in and looking at and taking your intuitions as actually rational. You're going and investigating the causal effects of the thing in the world to determine what they are. So it's like if you're looking at what an orange is, you're going to look at the qualities of an orange, the color, the texture, the taste, like where it grows, how you're going to be able to approach it, and you're going to be able to spot a ton of those, right? And then say that these look to me, in terms of the effect they have on me, the same. And so if I wanted to know what this was, if I had a doubt about this was, this actually erased that doubt. So that's his immature maxim of pragmatism. Except something comes along that he can't really account for, which is probability. So in the instance of probability, we don't actually know what the causal effects of something are going to be. The most classic and basic example of this is the head-tail coin toss. You're not sure whether you're going to get heads or tails in each individual discrete, as a result of each individual discrete action. So you can't just go and observe two different results, one where the person gets tails and one where the person gets heads, and decide they're different phenomena. You have to be specific as to what you're looking for and why you're looking for it in order to determine across individual instances of something, like the results of a coin toss, what kind of phenomena is being presented to you. So there's an evaluative process that goes into that. And this is where he gets really, really mathy. And so he realizes that it's not just us looking at the causal effects of things and having our senses hit by what things are like in the world. We actually go in and we evaluate things as they appear to us, and we seek things out and answer questions we have about things using this kind of evaluative process. We don't just regurgitate things from authority, but we don't go in a vacuum when we're investigating things. And so he switches the pragmatic maxim from looking at things by their causal effects to something he calls something that's more process oriented. So in other words, it's an indicative that matches a conditional. So when we're engaging in good inquiry and we make the statement, the cat is on the mat, what flows from that is that if you want to see the cat, then you look towards the mat. And so this becomes a conditional set of judgments that we make about the world. And the long story short with all of this is that there's some pretty bizarre phenomena that can be accounted for if we can kind of frame it in terms of these conditional judgments. One of the most interesting phenomena has to do with the nature of representation and the nature of kind of infinity, and how we make judgments when we look at discrete instance after discrete instance of something over a long, long period of time and come to sort of general conclusions about what's going on. Also, Peirce notes that even if simple discrete actions like tossing a coin result in an obvious yes or no, heads or tails, 1 or 0 each individual time, when taken across a wide swath into infinity, you actually see trends emerging where the answer is neither heads nor tails. And you have to have ways of accounting for both forms of reality at the same time, the discrete individual stuff and the blended out stuff. And so that's kind of how I'm prefacing this. And that's the beginnings of a wider metaphysical project Peirce engages in after he develops the pragmatic maxim later on in his life on metaphysics. But Peirce isn't just a philosopher, he's also a logician. He also is really important to mathematics. And so I kind of wanted to shut up now about the philosophical implications and hand it over to Dilvany about what he's doing then with his math when he's looking at discrete phenomena, when he's looking at trends over time, and he's looking at the notion of infinity, or looking at the notion of things repeating over and over in sequences, or probabilistic outcomes. And there's some cool stuff that emerges there too. So that's my intro spiel.
All right. Just for clarification, we read chapter 10. We actually linked the text down below if you're curious in reading Peirce. So I'm gonna have some notes I took on a physical notebook right here. So I'm going to be reading this, and I'm also going to be going through some graphing calculator demos that I worked out, but this is just here for the sake. I mean, I think one thing that really struck me from reading Peirce was the fact that he seemed to have a very a strong love for math, and just the way that he kind of talked about math, how he just brought up topics with such clarity and focus, and it all kind of really fit together. It a really good idea reading through. Everything flowed. So there was a purpose in bringing up each mathematical point. It wasn't just oh, here's a bunch of math. Each thing was building on each other, and it started to get this picture of how he really thought about the world and was trying to really break down these situations. So I want to try to go through and explain kind of what Peirce's logic was here, and kind of break you through some of the math. So I'm going to switch StreamYards to this.
Yeah, this is where what I'm saying about things that have a yes or no, 1 or 0 outcome in discrete instances actually end up graphing out to something that moves away from definite endpoints over time, becomes really clear. Kind of need a graph for it.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the page 135, where he introduces the thing of the infinite rich man versus the infinite bank, essentially.
Perfect.
So he assumes, for example, so his starting assumption is there's a probability, it's a 50-50 chance that you win or lose. So he introduces us to this kind of logic. Okay, so in this case, I just have it P so I can show off different examples. I actually did a little bit more math than Peirce does, just as a curiosity. But essentially, you have, if the chance of, yes, you have a question?
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Do you want me to read what he says about the scenario first, and then you can chart it out?
Yeah, sure. If you wanna set it up for everyone, I was gonna explain it, but yeah.
So he's saying there's a lot of problems connected with probabilities that are subject to doubt. So we can't just look at things straightforwardly by their causal effects. We don't know how they're going to work out. So one of them, for example, is this, and these are all the convolutions of probability. Suppose an infinitely large company of infinitely rich men sit down to play against an infinitely rich bank at a game of chance, at which neither side has any advantage, each one betting a franc against a franc at each bet. Suppose each player continues to play until he has netted a gain of 1 franc and then retires, surrendering his place to a new player. The chances that a player will ultimately net a gain of a franc may be calculated as follows, and then it kind of gets into the math from there.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about this is that one additional way to interpret, I think this might also make the logic a bit clearer, is that he's thinking about like how many games are you going to win on net? And the first logical thing that he does is say that the probability of, let's just say you sit down to play, that you will end up 1 franc up and leave the table. Well, if you want to, for example, let's just say we want to find the probability that you will, instead, let's say we play another game where you sit down at the table and try to win 2 francs. The probability of that is the probability of winning 1 franc squared. And here's the best way to think about it. So when you are one up, for example, well, that basically is the same thing as being neutral, essentially, but you're just 1 up. So from that position, you have to think relatively, because the chance of winning is independent. It doesn't matter how much you move. The chance of moving up 1 is independent. That's all that it's asking, essentially. Do you have any questions about that? This kind of idea that each event is an independent probability?
I don't. Do we have a audience?
Do you understand what I'm saying, though, about that once you're from... I was more asking Jalma if that came across clear, because also I would assume that you have probably a little bit more sophisticated... Well, yeah, I'm not sure. You know what I mean?
No, but, totally. I don't think there's any question about that, because keep in mind that... if you read what Peirce is saying about the pragmatic maxim not as sophisticatedly, it looks like he's only talking about discrete instances. And he's not anymore. And he doesn't want to just be talking about discrete instances. He wants to apply it to more complex phenomena. Sure. So you can... So the fact
this is a discrete instance still. Yeah, we're still in the realm of the discrete.
Exactly.
Yeah, of course.
So just to kind of clarify it, like you can win or lose in these discrete instances, one after the other, but they're still going to be, if you're going to infinity...
It's all relative to each other, yeah. So the best way to think about it is that each instance is independent. So going up 1, once you're up there, you're still in the same position that you were 1 below, so it's squared. So here's the logic Peirce makes. If you want to figure out the probability, which is x, of winning, getting 1 up, p amount of the time, so 1/2 the amount of the time, you will win. But then 1 minus p, or in the case of 1/2, that's just 1/2 the time, you will need to win 2 times. So you get this nice little polynomial right here. Which just means, it's a squared polynomial. And there's exactly 1 solution to this, which is 1. So that's the kind of interesting thing that Peirce drives at. So according to this logic that Peirce set up, that you either win or you lose, then have to win twice. Well, it comes out that everyone who sits down at the table and has a probability of, I guess that's one way of interpreting, but the probability is 1 that if you sit down to the table, you will win the game, which is kind of surprising, because if it's 50-50, that means that the bank is coming out, you expect half people to lose and half people to win. So how could it be that it seems that the probability is 1. It seems like it would be everyone, right? If it's a probability of 1, that's kind of the strangeness that Peirce is kind of trying to introduce us here. Which I found was very interesting. Just as like a side note, just about like the structure of this, I was playing around with this and I found out, well, of course, if you switch it, it has different solutions, of course, whatever you set p to. So I actually, because you can solve this very simply with like algebra skills, basically. So I actually get like these 2 nice solutions right here. So I'm not sure exactly how to interpret it, but in both cases, you could have like a probability of 1, even if, let's just say, the probability of winning is 0.1 or something like that. You only have 10th chance of winning. I think just from guessing that it is that the probability would be more like this blue curve right here. Yeah, just rolling the dice or any type of thing. It's like flipping a coin or doing any sort of probabilistic game. That's what he's talking about. He's thinking if you have an infinite quantity of money, what's the chance of coming up 1 franc ahead? But so the interesting thing I found about this, and this could have to go into the structure, this is just more interesting things to think about, is that this blue curve, which I believe to represent the probability of becoming 1 franc up. So, like, if it's at a certain, probability of winning, that's the probability that you'll have 1 franc. It's actually, this function right here is actually the same as this function right here, which was going to come up later when we talk about Zeno's paradox, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually the same function of going, in one example, 1/2 the distance plus 1/4 the distance plus 1/8, or 1/10 plus 1/100th plus 1/1000th. It's kind of adding up those infinitely small distances. We actually see this in this probabilistic formula. So there might be something about the structure of this game Peirce has set up, just as a side note that I'm, just some things I like to investigate here. Thought I would bring that up. Do you have any questions about that? Or probably shouldn't switch to the next slide, but.
Yeah, I think my questions are going to be better as like end remarks about the way that infinity and finitude work side by side. So there's models where you have discrete finite outcomes with each turn, but what results from the end of that is something like a 50-50 chance. And how could that be if there's discrete end results with each turn? I mean, it seems like a simplistic question, but it ultimately kind of gets at the heart of how can you have finitude in instance after instance, but in relation to infinity. Likewise, you can have a start and end point and an infinity of points in between those two endpoints, which is how you get part of Zeno's paradox about Achilles and the tortoise, which comes up later on.
Yeah, that's going to come up later on when we talk about the coin toss. I'm going to get into some of that more math. That's why I added that little section there about like this being part of the structure of the game.
Totally. And the only other question is eventually how's this going to play into the way in which insurance companies engage in marginal analysis, right? Like,
so I want to actually bring that up right now because I want to actually go into that. I have like 3 slides just preempting talking about that because there's actually some interesting things right here that explain what's going on in the insurance model that he brings up because he introduces derivative symbols which get into calculus, and also calculus deals with these kind of infinite processes, but also these kind of like questions. It's calculus is a way of taking these kind of continuous functions and like interpreting them, giving them, trying to find or adding up infinite quantities of things, finding like limits, interesting things like that. So they're very relevant to what Peirce is talking about here. So I just wanted to do a quick detour into some calculus stuff quickly, just because it'll be useful for it. Pretty much very bare bones stuff. So we have this function right here. It's x divided by 2 plus 1. So if you're in like school, for example, they'd be like, well, what's the slope of this function? It's pretty obvious. It's like 1/2. What's the point of this? Well, let's just say like this is a position function. This is over time. So at time 0, you're at position 1. So this is like in, meters or whatever. And then at like time 2, so 2 seconds later, you're at, 2 meters or something. And then you keep on going in this one direction. And this could be like an interpretation. And so you can figure out the speed pretty easily. The speed is the slope, 1/2. It's pretty simple, right? But you have a problem. This is something that like Newton did, who invented calculus. So this is like a problem of something you would encounter. So we have this function right here, p. So this looks really complicated. So it moves all and down. So the question is like, let's just say I have a point. I have this point right here. I'm dragging around this black ball. What is the velocity here? And so that's what the derivative was designed for. So the derivative right here, d by dx, I can just plug it in because this is a graphing calculator. It will find velocity functions. This tells us like how fast it's going at each thing. But for a visual representation of this, I basically created this line right here, which takes, it finds the velocity at a point and then draws a line. And so you see it's actually like tangent. So if you put the line going through the point, if you put this like, take the velocity, take this, derivative function, use it as like a line and draw it right through it, you can actually create these nice tangent lines, which kind of makes sense if it's the velocity, it's how fast you're going. So if you're going at this speed, then, you'd expect if you kept going that speed, you just go off in, a line, essentially. Yeah, so that's kind of the visual representation of thinking about it. And then if you do physics, for example, as I said, this is the velocity, and then you could also take the derivative again, and you get the acceleration then. So that's kind of how Newton.
Interesting. Like, it's so cool to see it visually, because I think one of the mistakes people make when they're thinking of things in terms of an XY axis is that you can only evaluate it the way you would evaluate the tangent. Like, you would just look at the velocity consistently over time, but there's a way of taking the tangents of a curve to figure out if the velocity is changing, how to map that on something that isn't just straightforwardly going in any kind of linear format. So you can actually, I think ultimately what this is
and that's
leading
what derivative does, essentially. It's a calculation of the tangent.
Is calculating from the tangent. I think ultimately this leads to is that, the levels and degrees of reality that you can map or that you can work out formulaically are actually pretty intense. It's not just that you have, discrete values, and if you load them on top of each other, eventually you get to infinity. It's that there are different levels of infinity, right? And there's different ways to map that and to understand that. And so you can have like an infinity of points between 2 points, and then the infinity of points between those 2 points is a different type of infinity than if you just went 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 into infinity. So that's the other thing that Peirce is getting at.
And that's very relevant to what we were just. That's I want to let's because I'm setting it up. So we're actually going to get into exactly how everyone the bank could not how basically everyone apparently could win the game, as we talked about in the last slide, but somehow nobody could possibly come out ahead because the chads are 50-50. How is that possible? So calculus will help. Cool, the calculus. Yes, that's how derivatives work. I basically just wanted to give a quick lesson, because that's definitely going to be coming up. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is so what's going on with these derivatives right here? So let's just say we have a function right here, x squared. This is a very simple thing you'd probably learn in algebra. So this kind of tangent line, we can approximate it. So what I've done right here is I've done the same thing, except I've created a little a offset where it says, okay, we'll take, this is something you'd do in algebra class if you're doing with a linear line. You take 2 points and then, do this nice little thing, and you'd find the slope. So you can do it here with a. Now I have some definite offset right here, and then it draws this little line. So it's basically the same thing we're doing, except I'm not using derivatives. I'm using an approximation. But as you take this closer and closer to 0, as you see, we begin to see it getting closer and closer to the derivative. So you kind of understand that principle, that basically as it gets closer and closer to 0, it's becoming closer to approximate this derivative, because the derivative is basically taking this small change as it gets down. That's kind of what the derivative is really doing.
So when you say when it gets closer to 0, it approximates the derivative. Basically,
as it gets closer, as it approaches, essentially, yes.
To translate that into the mind of somebody who's done a lot of philosophy but basically has zero mathematical background to speak of, that would be something along the lines of even if the values get closer and closer and closer together, they never quite reach 0. Like when you're dealing with subdividing and subdividing a quantity, for instance. Is that one way of looking at it?
Well, okay, so let me explain. So I'll show you something right here. Let's try plugging in 0.
Okay.
It breaks. So we don't have an answer. Yeah. But let's imagine that this gets ever so close to 0. What is this getting close to? Can you understand something like that? It's is this actually getting near something? What if it, as you see right here, it's different over here. So it's kind of very far off here. But as we start to move, does it actually, as we get to 0, is it getting closer and closer to some value? Is there a definite value that this will keep getting closer to? That's kind of the logic that this is getting. That's what a limit is really trying to answer. Sometimes there might not be an answer to a limit.
And actually, it's funny because when you talk about limits themselves, one of the main things that Peirce is interested in is whether or not we can ever have a value reach a limit. And that's related to him. That's related for him to the idea of whether we can actually know about something. Whether we would actually be able to ever distinctly answer with sufficient epistemic resources or knowledge-based resources a question that we asked, right? So presumably, with further and further fine-grained distinctions, we would continue to never reach 0. But he believes, he has this kind of agnosticism about the fact that maybe we could ever get to that limit. He thinks it could be possible.
Yeah. That's going to come up a lot on page 141 when we talk about the, what is it called? The commensability of the tangent of the diagonal of a square, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's actually very relevant because he's kind of talking about making approximations of things which don't have like answers. Essentially, it's going to get a little more complicated, but
I kind of want to nerd about one lovely quote that he calls the logical maxim. He gets into it. This is cheating because he gets into this in the 7 Systems of Metaphysics, which is chapter 13 in volume 2 of the Essential Peirce. And it's like, never allow yourself to think that any definite problem is incapable of being solved to any assignable degree of perfection. I like the mathematical precision of that. The idea that you can have an assignable degree of perfection. Yeah. Anyway, I thought that was a fairly relevant quote.
Yeah, that's especially later. I'll bring that up essentially. So look out for when we talk about page 141, the diagonal of the square. Essentially, that's going to be very relevant right there. But in some situations when we get to 0, like it doesn't have an answer, but sometimes it doesn't even have like a value that it gets near. Essentially, So sometimes there is no answer, but the question is, can we find an answer to this? And the problem is that this is 0 over 0. And so I'm going to demonstrate why 0 over 0 like breaks math. Because I remember when I first introduced 0 over 0 to you, you were like, well, what is it, like 0?
Yeah, I did. I made a dum-dum. And I was like, is it 0? And you're like, don't you do it.
No.
And you're like,
yeah.
freaking
Okay,
out
so
at me.
I'm going to explain exactly why that's wrong. I'm gonna basically hide these. Yeah, okay, great. So look at this. I've created a function right here. Y equals 1.5. So you see, this is a very simple function. It's literally just y equals 1.5. Basic, you get it?
Yeah.
Well, what if I do 1.5 x divided by x? Now, this doesn't seem like it should change the equation in any substantial way. We're just basically adding x's. I mean, you could cancel these out essentially, and you get
the x's
the same function.
There.
Yeah, but here's the problem though. When x is 0, it's 0 over 0. So if you think these two functions are equal, then in this case, when this is 0, then 0 over 0 would have to be 1 over 5 in this case.
That's what you're saying.
But you could do the same thing with any number. That's the problem. That's the thing that's the thing that's interesting. You could basically plug any number into here, like, oh, well, what is pi or 10 or any number, and it's an answer to 0 over 0. So 0 over 0 doesn't really have an answer. It's all relative in terms of functions. Essentially, for a function, then you can kind of figure out what is the limit. So in the blue case, the limit of there is no answer at hello. I think
it froze for a second.
Spike.
It's fine. So there's no answer for that because it's all relative, right?
Jama, are you there?
I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's no answer to this, but the limit. So the limit is 1.5, as we can see. So like generally, we can see as we get closer and closer, even though there is no answer here, we could say that the limit is 1.5. That's one way of looking at it in this situation.
Yeah,
Any
absolutely.
questions about that?
It's just a kind of a normie observation, which is basically that.
Shoot it out.
Part of the reason why when we talk about 0 over 0, we're talking about it relationally, is because the idea of absolute 0 isn't relevant. Like there has to be 0 of some quantity. There has to be 0 of something working in relation to some other factor. So 0 doesn't make any sense conceptually, like metaphysically, as a kind of quality in the world, unless it's in relation to something else. It's quality of relation, and he actually gets into this as a metaphysical form when we go on into when we'll talk about the maxim. Sorry, we'll talk about 7 Systems of Metaphysics, but so it's what he calls secondness or the relation, and so any quantifiers, any numbers, including 0, are relations, and they track phenomena that are qualities, but they themselves are not immediately apparent to us as this kind of raw thing. You can't have just sort of raw 0. It's a number of something. So that makes sense on a philosophical level as well, right?
Okay. And so I wanted to actually right here, I want to provide a little bit more of a careful kind of look how we can use this limit logic to begin to start thinking about solving the above problem right here. So I kind of introduced this 1.5 thing right here, but I want to kind of do this. So the initial question where we have this x plus a squared minus x, that was kind of the initial thing we were trying to think about here when we thought about, what is the derivative essentially. So we have this a, and the question is what happens when it goes to 0? Well, we can carefully deconstruct this by just taking the function and plugging in the values. So I've done right here is I've, actually squared this out. So your basic algebra skills, you can take a, x plus something and then square it, and then you can find the result. So in this case, it's x squared plus 2ax plus a squared minus x divided by x plus a minus x. That's basically the formula, expanded out. So do you kind of understand that that's just algebra, basically? Or...
Yeah, I mean, I understand that what you're representing algebraically, even if I don't know the specific values, right?
Yeah, it's just some algebra skills, basically. If you don't understand how I got to that, just review multiplying basically numbers in algebra, basically. So basically, if we can simplify this, so x squared minus x squared on the top, those cancel out, because if you have some a minus a, it's 0, basically the same thing. So on the top, we get 2ax plus a squared, and then the x's also cancel out, because that's x. So we get this function right here. But let's make note of something. There's an a on the top, and then there's an a on the bottom. So 2ax plus a squared divided by a. So just like in the same way we did earlier with the x multiplied the top and the x, we can just cancel those out. And then we get this bottom thing right here, 2x plus a. So if we want to know actually the value when it gets to 0, it's just 2x.
Interesting. So it shows basically algebraically that, the value of 0
this is how you prove a limit.
0.
Yeah. This is how they prove the derivative, essentially. Yeah, this is how. This is a proof for the derivative, yeah.
Oh, I see. And going back to the previous slide, the derivative being basically taking the tangent of a curve to determine
taking the tangent
some value.
That's the visual interpretation of what we're doing here, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So then now that we're talking about limits and we kind of have an idea of derivatives, and we kind of have an idea of limits, and we have an idea of values, do you want to take a stab at when Peirce gets into how insurance companies
yeah, that's what I was gonna work on next then. Yeah. Cool. That was literally the next slide. I just wanted to also note that this is the general function for a derivative. So you can do this with anything, essentially. There's a basic trend. It's you just take the power, reduce it, and then multiply the power in front. So you can look this up, but there's very basic rules. Calculus isn't that hard to get into in general. So
yeah, just a bit of a learning curve. No pun intended.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a learning curve, but the math isn't too burdensome here. Okay, let's get into the insurance pricing. Great. So here's the situation that Peirce introduces to ourselves. We have an insurance company. The insurance company is selling a product, and then there's a cost per person that's getting in the insurance company. So there's the payout for the insurance policy, how much money you get paid out if you get injured, and there's the probability that your customers are going to get injured. And so you want to price it, and then you have, how many customers that you can attract at a certain price. And you have all these different factors that Peirce introduces. Do you have anything you want to say here, possibly set up the problem or something? So
I don't have anything to say about this except what he's trying to do is he really wants to establish what he means when he says the probability of an event has a certain value P. Because he doesn't want us to go in assuming that when we're engaging in inquiry, we can just kind of decide that we're going to look for the thing that meets our pre-existing sense of what ought to happen. He says that when we're engaging in inquiry, we're looking to erase or literally itch a doubt, neuralgically almost. And so the doubt that we want to itch is we're trying to figure out, for instance, we're an insurance company, what level of losses we can sustain such that we're going to be able to still turn a profit without losing our customer base. And so basically, whether or not what he says is that according to the maximum pragmatism, then we must ask, this is right on the insurance section, what practical difference it can make whether the value is P or something else. We must ask how probabilities are applied to practical affairs. The answer is that the great business of insurance depends upon it. Probability is used in insurance to determine how much must be paid on a certain risk to make it safe to pay a certain sum if the event insured against should occur. So the one, can I just get into a little bit of background before you start with this? Because I kind of wanted to
Sure. That's what I basically just said, give the background quickly.
So that was basically the background.
Yeah.
that's the background of why he cares about insurance. More broadly, insurance became this big deal in the late 1900s in England in terms of property insurance, when people started to become trapped in very large enclosed kind of structures, all side by side by side, and basically like these industrial apartment complexes. And what happened was insurance companies realized, okay, we can get people to insure their property. But the difficulty was when you had like 10, 15, 20, 40 people all in a small square footage and all of them making roughly the same amount of money, everybody assumed that somebody else had covered the insurance necessarily, and so there'd be no problem if the thing went up in flames. So keep in mind, and the reason I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this weird story about how often people make mistakes when it comes to evaluating correctly how they ought to proceed in terms of buying or purchasing something to insure themselves. It's to say that, look, we can map out, using the math that Dilvany is about to explain, exactly how insurance companies calculate for risk, but ultimately what goes into that, what people work through on the front end of that, depends on things like social norms, depends on things like game theory to some extent, whereby I assume if the other person is getting us both insured, I can pay 0 and he can pay 10, when in reality he's paying 0 too, and we might both go up in flames. So a lot of how do I describe it? Like logica utens, or practical logic, is going into the calculations people make about values. That being said, there are also very complex mathematical probabilistic stuff that goes on when we figure maybe a person's willing to pay X amount for insurance. So just because we can work these things out mathematically doesn't mean that social factors and values and people's own calculations or miscalculations don't go into it on the front end. It still took people a long time to figure out that if I'm in a building with 14 other people, one of those 14 people may not cover my ass. They may be expecting me to cover them. So if nobody ends up covering anyone, we're all going up in flames. It took people a while to figure out that everybody should cover a little bit. So these are all also things that rely on social contract, that rely on rational self-interest maximizing, that rely on external social values. So all that still plays into this. And Peirce still cares about all those processes, even if he also cares about the math that insurance companies work out. So that being said, he does also care about how insurance companies work this out. So you're going to show us how he does that, basically.
Sure. And I also just want to say something that you're generally talking about, and this is something that you kind of mentioned earlier about mathematics and such like that, and that one of the things that I like about economics is that it's very heavily focused on mathematics. There's various principles. I'm having an argument with a friend basically about some economic things, and he kind of just takes like one graph and it's just like he makes like a bunch of assumptions out of like one kind of model. And like, yeah, but you have to like see how a lot of other different things affect. Like when you think about like economics, like it's not just merely showing this one model. This is like, you know, when I say like the price that people are willing to pay, there's a lot of things that factor into that essentially. So economics isn't just like these like models interact with each other. It's very complicated, some of the effects that you can begin to see once you go into studying. But still at the time though, a lot of this math that Charles Newsbury brings up is very advanced. And this math basically, this is called Marshallian scissors I'm using here. And he kind of uses some of the math that Alfred Marshall would use. I'm not 100% sure. We're unclear if he borrows the mathematical techniques from Alfred Marshall or not. I think it was about like 10 years prior to this. So he could have read it. So it's definitely possible. This is math right here, which he also uses something the problem is that he uses different math, so it looks different. Yeah, so I don't necessarily think he's borrowing, but still there's a lot of advanced thinking right here because he's using this marginal analysis. When people talk about like modern economics, a lot of people bring up stuff like subjective value, and that's definitely very important. But one thing people don't know a lot about is this thing called marginal analysis, which we're going to get into here. I just wanted to say that generally because I guess I think your main point is that there's a lot of factors going into economic analysis, and yeah, I don't want to downplay any other. I just wanted to say as somebody who's interested in economics, you have to kind of look at how trends intersect each other. But also another thing for doing quantitative analysis is to try to like focus on the snapshot and see how like, you know, control for as many factors as possible and see how one thing works. And then you can start linking things up together.
So quite literally, the things that I'm considering, the things I'm concerned about, are which values you would plug into this in order to calculate what
yeah, sure. You're also coming up with ways like why, for example, if we charge a certain price, why only will certain people buy it? Like, correct, what decides the fact that people value? Like, why are people, let's just say on our model right here, why are 5 people willing to pay $7.78 for this thing or more? And according to this math right here, we're just assuming it because I just wrote out some functions right here. But empirically, like, why is this? Like, how would you even calculate this thing to make it useful? That's like some interesting questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, on certain game theoretical models, or people had never encountered the phenomenon of insuring their property before, some people might make their contribution 0, assuming someone else's would be 10. And so we have no reason to automatically assume that people would even, be moderate in their approach to different things. The point about Marshall is actually important too, because what this shows about Peirce is that he's a really unique thinker across, cutting across a lot of contexts. Like, he's primarily known as the father of American pragmatism, and he's known as a metaphysician and a philosopher of science. But in addition to that, Dilvany and I were kind of working this out ahead of time. He delivered this lecture in 1903, and we know that Marshall was working on his own understanding of marginal analysis a number of years prior, but
1890s when he published. The marginal analysis didn't start until... sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No, it's fine. You made the very interesting point that a lot of people weren't actually formally aware of marginal analysis until much later on. So it's very possible and very cool that Peirce may have actually derived an understanding of marginal analysis independently of Marshall and these other people. Because we don't have good reason to assume he'd know, right? He'd know what Marshall was working on, because it was quite on the DL at that time, right? So
the smoking gun would be if he had if he had like formal marginal analysis before Carl Menger, which would be 1870. So if we can find works predating 1870 that include marginal analysis, that would actually be that's like enough to be like a serious that'd be serious economic news if we could find work of his on marginal. That's just a note, because that's when Carl Menger, the father of the Austrian school, he's very great. He also wrote another, interestingly enough, all of these people called their books The Principles of Economics. So Carl Menger called his book The Principles of Economics. A lot of his students had books called Principles of Economics. Another guy who independently discovered it after Marshall called his book The Principles of Economics, and Alfred Marshall also called his book The Principle of Economics. So,
so they're all trying to claim to that simultaneously.
So there's
a lot of principles. How about you start mapping?
All right.
You start mapping this out. I need to go to the bathroom really quickly, so I'm going to do that, and then I'll be back in a second. So,
I don't know what it is. Yeah.
So just start. You continue with mapping this, and I'll be back.
Are we here? I think I had a. So I'm gonna start mapping this out. Cool.
Okay.
So, sure. So basically, here's what we're. Yeah. Okay. So here's what we're dealing with right here. So when you price something, essentially, given a certain price, certain people will, a certain quantity of people will buy it. So we kind of have this model right here. This curve represents this blue curve right here. If we want to sell 10 policies, we'll have to, sell it at $3.67. That's like an example, according to this blue curve. This is arbitrary. This is just, for the sake. Now, to ensure everyone, so essentially we're thinking about what is the probability of the payout and what is the quantity of payout. So multiplying those two numbers, I just put 1 because we're just doing a rough visual estimation of what he's talking about. So the company, when they sell an insurance product, they get revenue. This is a profit would be revenue minus expenses. So we're just thinking about the revenue here. Following. So the revenue basically is how many units you sold, which is X. X will be the quantity here. And then P of X, this is just the price that you need to price in order to sell that many units. So that's kind of how you get the total revenue. So you get this nice little red curve. Now, as we notice here, what are we currently discussing? Oh, hello. We're discussing Charles Sanders Peirce and his thoughts, and so I'm breaking down his mathematics and such. So we're talking about his example of insurance. So if you want to, we talked about this a bit earlier, but if you want to go check that out.
Yeah, so that's going to be on
so total revenue. Yeah, 136, you should be able to find that, and that's where he discusses it. So page 136. So total revenue. So you have X times the price that you can sell it. So that's basically what he talks about. So you have the price, and then you have the quantity. So this is the total revenue. Then there's this additional thing. I'm actually working this out independently from Peirce's logic. I'm doing it in a neoclassical sense, like the stuff you'd learn in modern school, but it works out very similar. You get this formula right here. So we're looking at the derivative. So this is how much more. So the derivative is the change. So we're looking at how much more revenue would I get if I sell another unit. So trying to get that curve right there. And so this is the marginal revenue, which is this purple curve right here. And I actually... I could just take the derivative normally using like this the graphing calculator, I think, but I manually solved it. The derivative of xp is x, then the derivative of p plus p, essentially. P is the price, yeah. So I just manually solved this. If you want to look up how this works, basically it's just the calculus product rule, essentially. So you need to know a little bit of calculus. But it's generally pretty simple. You're looking at so this right here is the derivative. So this curve is going down. So you're looking at, you sell another, so the basic interpretation of this is that you sell one more unit. So you get P from that unit, but then all the other units, which is X, you then have to discount them by this change in P. So this is the amount that you're discounting in order to sell more units. That's kind of the general interpretation of where this is coming from. So when we're thinking about this is something very important. This is called marginal analysis right here. When you produce a unit, you want to make sure that you're making money on each unit. So you want to make sure that the revenue, the marginal revenue you get, is greater than the marginal cost. Mm-hmm. So the marginal cost is very simple. It's 1. But the marginal revenue is different because you have this demand curve, which is kind of dynamic, and you also have the total revenue. So you kind of get this. So basically, you want to sell as long as this curve, this is the revenue curve, the marginal revenue curve, is greater than the marginal cost, which is the revenue gained from insuring one more person minus the cost of insuring one more person. That's kind of that's the genius of marginal analysis. You want to do that, and then when it balances out, when you get to this point right here, this is where you'll stop. So do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions except one clarification kind of statement, which is that we were talking about how modern economics visualizes things in terms of continuous curves versus traditionally it was about discrete values. So obviously when we're looking at things on a curve, it could end up stopping at selling exactly 6.825 units. But in reality, you could look at it as you could sell up to exact units. And so I don't think people realize that a lot of economic analysis is as precise descriptively or as discrete as people think it is. They're actually making these calculations down to the last unit.
Sure.
And so they got to get really good demographic information to know how to do that in terms of what people are likely to pay and on, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of issues, like how do you know this demand curve? Because the only way to actually, because there's a lot of things, this is where you get somebody like a lot of people who kind of say that these models are complete bullshit. And to be honest, they kind of almost are, because this is something you'll actually learn. I don't think any economist will, most economists will agree with this. How do you know what this blue curve is? How can you possibly figure out that if the price was this, only X amount of people will buy it? You almost have no idea. You have to do there's ways you can attempt to measure generally this value right here, which is the change in the change in price. So basically you can see okay, what happens if the prices increase? Sometimes people increase the price of their product because inflation and things like that, or just changes in people don't like the product anymore, or just general things that people just have sudden changes. Then you can kind of see, well, how did that affect the purchasing? And you can kind of figure out these how sensitive demand is. But all of that is linear then, so they're so you can have demand curves that are all sorts of shapes as long as they're downward sloping. Basically, yeah. Do
you want to hear a pretty cool tangent about this that gets back into some of how?
Sure. Can I actually finish this last point about where? So basically, Peirce is basically he worked out basically a very similar solution, right? Basically the same solution. The only problem is that I don't know if this was his mistake or if it was transcribed. But if you do the math, it should be, so if you think about it, the price should be equal to the cost minus the quantity times this change in price. And it's an honest mistake because the change in price is negative. So, but the problem is that somebody might have made, if you read Peirce in 136, he actually puts a plus sign right here, but it would have to be a minus sign because the change in price with relation to quantity is always negative. So, and the price would have to be greater than the cost. So, in order to maximize profit, so it would have to be a negative right here. So that's probably one of the only mistakes I found in Peirce so far. Anyway,
so that's going to be Dilvany actually.
What are you going to have to say now?
Yeah, so it matters because it means that Dilvany actually succeeded at correcting Peirce potentially. So she's kind of like, bam, logic is off. It is not as established, and like you made this mistake. And this is a joke that you said a lot of mathematicians or people have with each other, where somebody will be working on this like super intricate proof for like 3.5, 4 weeks.
Oh yeah,
and then somebody will come in and be like, yo, bro, your like plus is a minus, your minus is a plus, and just like completely rip into
it. Yeah, like you hand somebody, like, here's my notes. They're like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, you made you messed up the signs on page 3 or something. That happens so much. Like, there's like times when I was undergrad and I was like, oh man, like I was interested in a bunch of interesting problems that were like unsolved, and I would occasionally work on it like a retard or something. Like, oh yeah, I'm gonna solve it. But you should totally keep your hopes up because you can. It's totally possible. But I'd be like, oh man, I'm on to something. Then I realized, oh shit, I just, that like happens all the time. Yeah.
If you were a philosopher, you'd publish this as Dilvany's correction, and it would become like a really popular paper in response to Peirce. So you should consider it.
It's like, look, oh man, I just debunked. I mean, this is like easy. Like I was just like, oh yeah, Peirce has made a con. All I had to do was graph it out in the standard economic models of like basically that you would know. Is that what we're gonna? There's one thing I want to bring up. There's an interesting reading of Peirce right here because he's talking about how like trying to deal with probability like often like seems to break these pragmatic ways of doing things. But I think that one of the points that he's trying to get at here is that like probability and like and trying to like pragmatically like maximize, these are like real like things that have real consequences and people actually like care about them, and like maximizing your like you could like there's a definite solution. Like this is you've done the right things to maximize your profits. That's like an actual thing you could tangibly do in reality. And then working backwards, you could almost then start to figure out like, okay, well, what is the slope of the demand curve or the change in price over quantity, or what is the probability of the payout, or what is the cost essentially would be the implication of that. So there's a lot of things you could work backwards, and how these are things that people already, first of all, these are things that people already use, but then you can also look at people doing like good behavior, and then you can try to reverse engineer. That's kind of an interesting interpretation I got out of Peirce. We had some discussion about that, but
yeah, because reverse engineering itself is and working backwards is so similar to tracking things according to their causal effects that it's almost like Peirce shows his hand philosophically, even in his economic or mathematical analysis. So basically what you articulated was the pragmatic maxim, just redone in a different mode. So this is...
Yeah, I understand. That's because when I read that, I was like, oh, this makes total sense. Like part of the reason I was bringing this out is he's talking about how like these mathematical truths can help us like think about, once we start to apply it to how people behave in the real world. Like he's bringing this out because this is how people use them, but he's also showing that these values are things that people have to calculate. These aren't like obvious things. You can plug them in, but then you could also, there's like different ways that you can begin to start measuring these things, and it all fits together. So
totally.
Cool. Do you want to talk about the next thing, or do you have any other comments?
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about like how economists say like marginal analysis is bunk, because how could you even determine what's on that blue curve, right? And it kind of fits in.
Well, no, I don't think marginal analysis is bunk, but they're talking about more just like trying to. They're saying that this curve is only is theoretical, but it's not necessarily completely practical. It's more of a theoretical model. It's not totally bunk, they don't say, because of course companies price and they have ways of doing it, but it's not like we can't possibly know the entire curve. Yeah, that's all. That's just to clarify what exactly I said. I wasn't saying it's bunk. Yeah.
No,
this curve is revered.
Strong in like the curve is revered. I was being too strong in my takedown of it, but it's also like the important point that we couldn't. There's how do we actually track those values? And so basically, I think a lot of what Peirce is upset about and annoyed by is really only relates to things that are not operative in nature. So given that people's unique social behaviors aren't what he would call naturalistic principles, and so naturalistic principles like the laws of physics, or the way in which we're going to see certain things occur in causal reactions necessarily because of their nature. So in general, so I don't really know how far to get into this, but you have philosophers, anti-realist philosophers like Hume, who would say that just because something, I'm being I'm simplifying things extraordinarily right now, but the idea that even if you're looking at something that occurred, he's really trying to establish the notion, Hume is, of causal necessity, because he wants to kind of understand and overcome the idea of, just because I saw something happen a million times, how do I know it's going to ever happen again? And this is a really, this is the kind of point that you would assume that Peirce would, the kind of Humean point that you assume Peirce would kind of piggyback off of. And it's like, well, we know that causal necessity is, understanding and is mind dependent. And so if we're able to access the universal and blah, blah, maybe we'll know it happens again. But Peirce kind of like he's an interesting thinker because he veers off into kind of left field instead. And he says, no, I'm actually a realist. I'm a scholastic realist. And what I believe is that general principles actually really are operative in nature, but not elsewhere. So you could never fully plug those values in determinately for that blue curve in an economic analysis, but you could if you were engaging in like analysis that involves physics. And his reasons for being a scholastic realist and seeing general principles as being really operative in nature has to do with the way in which he develops his metaphysical categories. And so this is a whole other stream potentially, and we'd probably want to both like go in and read that shit and then kind of bring it back again. But it piggybacks really well off of what we're talking about here, just because this is the most sophisticated iteration that you've shown here in basic sort of economic marginal analysis that companies engage in, etc.
It's a lot more complicated,
Yeah, I mean,
video for even more like why this is totally not even actually how they do it. There's even more. Anyway.
Yeah. So basically, imagine that this was made as complicated as possible. This would be the most complex, nuanced, subtle example of what the pragmatic maxim could be used for. In terms of observing things via their causal effects. His metaphysics, though, allows for cases where general principles are operative in a way that nobody could deny based on how phenomena react, how do I describe it? Like how we can measure and understand and interact with phenomena such that his usual pragmatic maxim doesn't really apply anymore. And so he is still interested in these kind of natural categories. So there's a limit to kind of what he thinks can be understood via even a sophisticated version of the pragmatic maxim, because he does believe that even if we can only represent reality to ourselves, akin to having an infinity of values in between two finite numbers, we can only represent certain things to ourselves, yet both of those things have their own type of reality and they do interact with each other. So, and there are general principles that we can observe if we look at the ways in which those two different categories of things interact. So it gets a bit metaphysically complicated, and general principles are often troubling because they do involve things like, how do we map infinity between two finite points? We know that this is going to be this way because we know there's this other thing operating in the background that kind of roughly corresponds to the finite things we actually observe, but we can't ever put them together. They're not the same type of phenomena. However, we know that in general, by law of nature, these theoretical physics models or these infinitudes between two finite points actually do exist in some meaningful sense. But we're not going to be able to look and be like, oh, let's go observe them. Or let's say that they're the same as finite points, or they're the same as material things. So it gets kind of like real trippy later on in Peirce. He's like 60 and super angry at the point at which he comes up with his metaphysics. But this is just like a really cool way of looking at how you can take discrete quantities or specific behaviors and map them in ways that show how they approach limits, and show how finite things interact with infinite things, right? So,
just as a side note, this is one of the reasons why I like economics, because economics basically what it's trying, like one way of thinking about it is it's like the study of human actions. You're trying to think about like modeling people's actions and try to figure out like mathematical ways to study and put it. And I've been reading like microeconomic theory, like advanced stuff. You're dealing with utility maximization, and like oh yeah, people have a utility curve. And then they're like, well, what is your utility curve? And they're just like, well, we don't have an answer. And then like, but there's like ways we can attempt to measure it. And there's like all these different, like, there's like an entire, it's like, well, we don't have an answer for what a utility curve is. Just assume everyone has this thing, utility. Like everyone has their own personal utility. That's, that's how we measure. But there's no way, there's all these interesting techniques and it's just basically math. It's like, okay, well, what if we offer you a 60% chance to win $1 and a 40% chance to lose $1? Will you take this or will you not? And that tells you a little bit about your utility curve, all these different ways of thinking about things. Does
so I have a question for you.
Yes, what's that? Before we move on to the next one.
Related to those utility curves, that kind of thing. And it's that basic thing that I got stuck on, where it's like your individual preferences could be absolutely contradictory when taken as an amalgam. So if you have like A, B, and C, I
you're talking about non-transitive. Can I just preface this? You're talking about non-transitive properties. Exactly. I'm not exactly familiar. That's a subset of psychology. The one thing about just one thing I want to say about like models of economics, there's different like schools of ways to think about like economic behaviors. Some people choose to model it in non-transitive ways. There's critiques of this because let's say you have like collective action, for example, like where you have to decide things as a country. You can get non-transitive behavior with totally like transited ordinal preference. Ordinal basically just means that it's clearly ranked. So you can have clearly ranked preferences of individuals, but create as a society non-transitive preferences. So like it's kind of so this idea so it's very hard to say like are people's these kind of formal assumptions of mathematics, they're hard of economics. The question generally is like, are we going to assume people have non-transitive, if that's possible? Is that a possible state, or should we model other ways?
Like not what I mean when I'm saying we should probably just explain quickly what I mean when I'm saying like non-transitive properties, or like an example of that. So the example that I had was if you have three people and you have three options like A, B, and C, person one may prefer A to B to C, person two may prefer B to A to C, and person three may prefer C to A to B. And so what you end up with a paradoxical loop whereby A is better than B, is better than C, is better than A. So it's hard to then figure out if you wanted to do a utility calculus for all those people and say like, what's going to optimize our results? What's going to lead to the net happiness utility? You literally have this contradiction of A is better than C, but C is better than A, and you don't know how you're going to actually maximize that utility. Right?
Hold up, I made a little thing in the other day because I was thinking of talking about when you said the Condorcet paradox. And also some other things. I've been doing some reading. So let's just like, here's just like an example of, this is as a side note, we're going off on a tangent here. So let's say you have like three different like groups of like voters, essentially. They are about like a third of the population. So you have people who are like, they want to reduce spending, which is like right over here. Then you have another group up here, the blues. They want to like build more parks. And then you have the reds. They want to build more like bombs, essentially. So both of these groups, they want more spending. So, but the thing is, you need a majority to win the election. So there's potential coalitions you could have here. You could have like the Less Bombs Coalition, the Parks and Bombs Coalition, or the Less Parks Coalition, where you kind of get mixes of like, various types of spending on different things. Essentially, that's kind of the idea. This is kind of like the political landscape. But the problem generally is that there's no actual like definitive like solution that you could, in this case right here with these voters, there's no actual, equilibrium state. Because, if, for example, in one election, like the Less Bombs Coalition could win, then the next election, easily one of these other two coalitions can form and steal them away. It's a totally possible thing. So you'll never actually get a stable equilibrium, even if the individual preferences are stable And of course, like they're ranked. Essentially, you want to choose whichever coalition is the least distance from you.
Well, this is why
non-transitive is more non-transitive behavior modeling is more is less controversial in terms of groups, but it's very controversial in terms of individuals because it breaks a lot of the mathematical models. The question is, do you want to get rid of our mathematical assumptions, or do you want to try to find other ways and explaining it as this kind of like thing, like that's basically the best way to put it.
I think that's really I love the Peirce and bombs as like the two variables here. It's pretty awesome. Peirce and bombs in Peirce. It's just hit a maximum absurdity point with it. I think that's one of the reasons why I've talked to certain friends and stuff about the inutility of just like simple left-right analysis in politics, because often you end up in these kind of paradoxes where the amalgam of choices you can make will never actually work or lead to a kind of equilibrium around certain subtopics, because I've always found that kind of analysis problematic insofar as whenever you're talking to someone who's not as politically informed about how they ought to get politically informed, invariably they have to take one of these, I know you have to take one with someone, political compass tests. And the political compass test will ask a bunch of moral, ethical, economic, and sort of practical policy related questions that you could have totally contradictory views on for each individual item, and yet it gets kind of steamrolled into one coherent ideological view. That's really, really shitty inquiry on Peirce's view too, because in that instance, what you're doing is you're going in and you're using kind of like intuition about how your views might shake out through a sieve if we put certain limitations and factors in play. And then you kind of end up solidifying yourself as a certain type of political actor based on often something as ridiculous as the amalgam of your responses to different questions. And people do this. And then there's the weird, horrible policy-related and political results of that. That's why pragmatism avoids that, because it looks at things issue by issue, item by item, and traces out what seems to be the stronger arguments when we look at the causal effects of holding certain positions and on and on. So you don't end up in a situation where you end up committed to something that you then have to kind of post hoc, like after the fact, embrace. And I think a lot of people end up getting steamrolled into having to embrace things that they don't hold as views. It's really weird, actually, how it often works.
I just wanted to bring up something. This is an old thing. I made a video on this, but it was on a channel that I might actually redo this video. It was a little thing I did on it's called gas station centrism. So are you familiar with the median voter theorem? And also, are you familiar with hoteling, or whatever it's called? Yeah. So basically, this idea is why are gas stations next to each other? Because so the paradox would be something like, if this Exxon station was here, this would be close. So this would be the minimum travel time for everyone. If this Exxon station was here and this Mobile station was here, that's the paradox. So why are they both in the center essentially? And it's basically, this is the only equilibrium, position where they both attract. Because if they're both in the same position, then they'll split the customers basically. So it's the same thing with politics, really, is that people rush the center, even if it's unpopular, because everyone to the left and everyone to the right, or whatever dimensions we're measuring right here, has to choose the one that's closest to them either way. And so if they, basically it's basically the, if you move too much to the right, then of course somebody will pull up these two. So you're fighting for these kind of in the center customers, basically. That's kind of how the two-party system, that's a basic thing you learn in political economy, like the median voter theorem. I just want to bring that up quick because we were talking about that as a side note. But I want to get back to the main Peirce. But since we were talking about
that totally. It'd
be a shame not to bring this up because this is I'm probably gonna redo this video and actually do a nice article write up to talk about this. I'm thinking of doing some videos on political economy coming up. So I love that topic.
I'd be happy to talk to you about that too, because I think that it fits a lot in with philosophical notions of negative versus positive stances. So the idea that you hold a stance because you're forced into a certain argumentative position or to adhere to a certain set of facts because everything opposing you, everything else is unpalatable to you in some substantial level. So you end up automatically positioned somewhere versus you made a bunch of positive arguments. You built up something from premises to a conclusion, and you said, "Okay, this is why I believe this. That's why I'm putting myself there."
And so this is this is a game theory model that proves basically that centrism, even if it's technically unpopular, is going to be the default of a two-party system like math. Sure, it doesn't always work out that way, but you tend to get centrism even if people are polarized, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
So nobody wants it, but it's like the only way they can both work. Nobody.
It's the only way that you can really,
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
It's kind of that like minimum distance calculation, like both gas stations, like two steakhouses. It's basically the same thing that means that all the 5 gas stations are next to each other. Like, why don't you space them out? Well, it's because, if you move, then you're getting out of that. It's the prime real estate. It's not about efficiently serving your customers. It's about what's the most prime. If you move away, sure, it's more efficient to your customers, but you're talking. Everybody wants to go for the prime real estate. The prime real estate is centrism, even if it's a burden. It's hard to do. It's still prime real estate. So anyway, well, if I try to when we talk about economics, it's about telling like stories. Essentially, it's not just math. It's also like stories, and a lot of economic situations have multiple cases. So you want to kind of try to bring up multiple examples and draw conclusions, things that relate to people, and that's kind of like it's basically like it's basically what economics is generally like its history about. Anyway, let's talk about limits here because. The prize of infinity over infinity, because this is how Peirce answers the initial problem that we had here, which was that like how can like if we're doing like a 50-50 like win-loss, how can like the probability be 1 that everyone walks away with that the probability 1 that you walk away with 1 franc ahead? Doesn't that seem illogical? And so Peirce basically invokes this kind of logic of limits, which is kind of, remember earlier we talked about 0 over 0. Well, we also want to figure out what is infinity over infinity. And so like people might think like, is that like infinity? Like that's like the dumb example. It's not, because sometimes it could be infinity. That's a total plausible answer, but in some cases it's not. So right here, for example, we have this function right here, which is 5x squared plus 10x minus 13 divided by 7x squared minus 11x plus 1. So we have this nice little function right here. But so in this case, when x goes to infinity, we'll have infinity divided by infinity. But here, the value is 5 over 7. So any questions?
Well, I don't have too many more questions about limits. I think we kind of want to wrap it up though soon because we've done like the derivatives, we've done the limits.
Sure. So basically in the same way that we can have, so in the same way we can have right here, in this case right here, this function right here, this is infinity over infinity, but this is 0. So you can have a case where there's an infinite amount of people who will go to the table and lose money, but the infinity that will, the total infinity of people who sit down to play is so much larger that we kind of get into these situations where the infinity of winners can be 0, and the infinity of losers can be 0. So therefore, the probability of winning is 1. So technically, you could lose if you sit down at the table. Just the probability is 0 because out of the infinite cases, yours is just infinitely small. And this is just one example. If the infinity grows by linearly as opposed to quadratically, then
exactly. And so I'm Sunday saying that we should answer questions. I definitely plan on doing that. And I really appreciate the questions. I think we do it probably after we're finished.
Okay, we're in like the final like stretches. So
we're in just the final stretches. The one thing I wanted to say about that though was that it relates to there being different types of infinity, right? And so the idea that, and also you can say like, I think part of the absurdity he's trying to draw through this picture of like, going to Monte Carlo and there being like an infinitely rich bank and people who can play infinitely with infinite amounts of money, is that value 1 for the win or loss in the discrete instance still matters. It's still relevant, but it doesn't matter if it's 1 of infinity. Like it loses, it could exist, but it's not relevant, and the infinity itself never reaches, the infinite value never reaches its marginal limits. Even in the one instance, the person got a value of 1. So that's like kind of the frustrating, seemingly paradoxical thing that he gets at. So I'm gonna let you wrap up. Then we're gonna probably go into questions.
So we have like maybe like one. We have like 1 or 2 more things after those. So basically, so Peirce introduces this thing called the coin toss, which is kind of another critique that you would have of probability, essentially. So he basically is like, okay, so you keep on flipping coins until you get a heads. That's how he sets it up. So what is the probability that you will have a certain string of tails, essentially? So there's like a 1/2 probability that you'll have like one string of, like a 0 string of tails. So 0 tails just get a head on your first go. And there's a 1/4 that you have 1 tails and then a head, 1/8, basically like that. So you have the standard probability. And then he proposes this reward right here, which is -2. So it flops. So if you got 0 tails, then you earn 1. If you had 1 tails, then you lose 2. If you got 2 tails, you earn 4. So you kind of have this oscillating back and forth. And so what he shows here, and this is part of a calculation that you can do in probability, where you take the probability and you multiply it by the outcome. This right here is the reward. And then if you take all the outcomes, the probability, then you can get something called the expected value. That's kind of something you learn in probability theory, and that's kind of a way of judging the value of making a choice. Like, what is the probability of all the outcomes, and what is the magnitude? How much do you value each outcome? But the problem that we have right here is this oscillates. So you get 1/2, 0, 1/2, 0, 1/2, 0. So what is the answer? That's kind of the question.
Because when you're tossing the coin, you're oscillating.
Well,
you're creating an oscillation.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not even that. No, it has nothing to do with tossing a coin. It has to do with this reward right here. Because if the reward was different, this wouldn't oscillate. This might actually converge to a value. This has nothing to do with the coin. The coin structure is something. It's this reward right here, and I'll actually get into earlier. Next slide, I'll basically explain this to you. But he further breaks this by introducing this thing right here, which increases the reward. So it's -2 to the power of x squared. In this case, there is no expected value. We can't. There's no cap. This right here is technically invalid, but we can kind of get what it's going. This right here totally breaks it. So if I turn this on, it's like up here. It won't converge. It'll keep on radically up and down, up and down. It'll grow bigger. This doesn't converge, but at least makes a little bit more sense. This right here is impossible to evaluate. There's no tools that we can use to evaluate. It's insolvable. But I think, though, like one thing that Peirce is getting at here is that these kind of examples are impossibly absurd. Like this kind of like exponentially growing win or loss. Like, when is this going to happen? I think he's also kind of showing the absurdity of these situations where expected value breaks down as well. Like, sure, there's cases where this kind of thinking breaks down, but also like this is kind of like fucking like it's like double, like what's going on here? It's kind of absurd. That's part of the way I want to think right here. But so to answer what's going on right here with this kind of probability right here and why this breaks down, we're going to talk about Zeno's paradox just real quick. So basically we have Achilles and the tortoise. No, we're not talking about the labor theory of value. Like, I don't think it's ever been brought up in this stream. I don't think I plan to talk about the labor theory of value here. That's not really relevant to Peirce. We'll get to we're going to answer questions in a minute. Okay, so basically how this works is that Achilles, it gives the tortoise a head start. So he's like 1 mile ahead. So the tortoise runs like half as slow as Achilles. So we can kind of, and here's the interesting thing. Let's observe like how far the tortoise is ahead of Achilles when the Achilles gets to where the tortoise is. Let's say he's 1 mile ahead. So we'll move to the next iteration. So Achilles is here and the tortoise is ahead of him. And then let's see, well, how far is the tortoise when Achilles gets, 1.5 miles along on the journey? Well, the tortoise is still ahead of him. We go to 3, the tortoise is still ahead of him. We can keep on doing this infinitely. And so like the general like question that you have to think about when you think about the Zeno's paradox is that, well, it would seem that Achilles would, surpass the tortoise. Right. Because, he's running faster, but seemingly we could keep on crafting various situations where the tortoise is ahead of him, and thus we need to kind of think of, invent this like limit logic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What's important about this and how it fits into limit logic is that in each instance, Achilles is marginally closer to the tortoise. Like you go through an infinity of instances, and in each instance, he's ever so slightly closer to the tortoise. And that, Peirce gets into that more in the metaphysics later on. He gets into the paradox in particular. Okay.
We might not talk about that today, but because I want to try to get, because we kind of want to decide.
We should get to questions. There's some really good questions.
There's some good questions. But basically, in general, there's a solution that you can find for this kind of like one. So basically, the torus is going 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/4. And there's a really cool logic, and it's this curve right here, which is 1 divided by 1 over x. But the problem is that this is only valid when, you know, between -1 and 1. Once you go to 1, then it's just 1 plus 1 plus 1. That also doesn't make sense. And then -1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 1. That also doesn't really make any sense, as we observed. So Peirce is kind of showing that you're explicitly trying to break the terms of where this is valuable from. But if you did it anywhere in here, which is, you know, pretty satisfactory, then you can find a solution. As you can find using this kind of solution right here, you can derive this formula, you know, probably not enough time. Well, you can find that in other places. We're just going to go through. But you can find that actually the tortoise can only have the advantage up until 2, for example. So this advantage only lasts as long as the tortoise is below 2, using this formula, which is derived from kind of trying to take this infinite, summing these little tiny parts together. So that's kind of what this kind of exposes. Any last questions before we move on to the next part? And probably let's answer some questions and not get into this.
Let's. I think we should cut it here because we've got a lot of you've done a lot of really.
We've done a lot. I want
to honor it and actually give us time to go through it and stuff and be careful about it. So let's cut it here.
Yeah, let's cut it here. Yeah. We'll talk about the fucking square, the fucking triangle next time. Excuse my language.
Yeah,
but Peirce's hot
takes right now
are real crazy.
I know, it's I gave you Peirce, and it's wow, it's
we
never
for
ending.
We talked for an hour and a half. Yeah. So anyway, cool. Let's answer some questions. Yeah. Sorry, Sunday. What's up?
So can I ask one of the questions? I'm going to answer a question directed.
Answer a question.
Yeah, and so basically, and in terms of Sunday's thing about invite me on for that, probably in a future stream, I think there's a lot of stuff that intersects between what all three of us do that could be really productive. So the question for me, if pragmatism is more individualistic and good, while the other isms by which we make choices carry a group imperative, do people not be pragmatic because it's more damaging? So the way I take that is that a lot of people make, and I think I misled everyone by the way I framed the pragmatic maxim of looking at things from their causal effect as being the greatest form of clarity we could get about something, because we use all forms of reasoning all the time. So we use intuition, and we use practical reason or logica utens, and we use formal reason or logica docens all the time, and we use math all the time. So basically, the point though is that if you want to get to a grade of clarity in your thinking that allows you to truly understand as much as possible the phenomena that you're examining without prejudice, you would want to look at it in terms of causal effects, or you'd want to look at it in terms of, if I seek this, then I will go there under these propositions. You want to look at it from the back end. And so a lot of what you talk about, you mentioned reverse engineering. That's basically a really kind of interesting way of framing some of what Peirce might be getting at in the pragmatic maxims. So the people in general have a very, very hard time using reasoning from causal effect rather than reasoning from premises when they're engaging in thinking, because our brains tend to like to go from presuppositions, right?
Yeah.
So my answer to that is that we use all of them, but ideally we would use the third. Creative clarity. What's another Okay, I'm not going to talk about the fuck Muda triangle right now. What do you? So do you have,
I just want to actually have a little thing right there. So can I have I want to particularly address this. So I think what John was also saying here about this kind of think about things of individualism and good is that you can, it's more just sure, those are values that you could bring into it. Let's just say if you're trying to pragmatically think about individualism, but I don't think he's necessarily giving a specific, at least in this chapter, he's not giving a specific view of what the good is. He's not even saying that pragmatism is individualistic. Pragmatism is mind dependent, and so he's not saying something. Yeah, your mind could value individuals, and you could be a libertarian that thinks pragmatically, but those are other values that originate in that's mine. Yeah. Well, I'd also say that he would say that inquiry proceeds the most correctly. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's individualism. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think he'd also say that inquiry proceeds the most correctly when it's the amalgam of various people's observations of the causal effects of things in the world, not just one person's perspective, but many, 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 right?
Sure.
So you can kind of map reality more effectively that way.
I'm also trying to, because my audience, I guess, is different from President Sunday, because I also, I talk about, like, my political opinions a little bit here, so I don't know exactly where they're coming from. They could also, like, because I generally talk about, like, libertarian ideas and stuff like that, so I wonder when they say individualistic and good if they're talking about, like, a very specifically libertarian view of it, and that's why I just wanted to bring up generally thought. Because it seems like they were asking about politics. I don't think pragmatism is a political philosophy in the same sense. Like, it's not.
No, it's definitely not.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Let's see.
What other question about can we use
question here?
L'Hopital's rule to explain the INF?
No. Answer.
Okay, I didn't even know what that means. So.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, when you're talking about, I think L'Hopital's rule is specifically used in the 0/0 case. I can't remember if it is used in the infinite. Okay, so basically it's just another way of calculating zero. So it's basically just a way of, like, calculating these 0/0 cases. So it's just another method that mathematicians have developed that you'll learn about in calculus. This is, if you want to learn about calculus, I'll teach you. DM me on Discord. I'll give you the friends and family discount. $15 an hour. I'll explain all this to you. Yeah, I'm serious. That's a good deal.
It's a good deal. You could map that on a curve, and it'd be a damn.
Yeah, I'll break out all my curves, and we'll, I'll give you special attention. So, anyway.
So Sunday, aside from backseat driving the conversation, which fair enough, and probably should have answered comments earlier. Do you have any other specific contributions?
I thought this conversation was between distant people, yet you are talking about
triangles.
Oh my god.
Oh man. Yeah.
I want to talk about triangles.
He's got to ask a question if he's going to backseat drive, though.
Yeah. What do you guys? Okay, let's look around. Some earlier. Yeah, just to clear, like, somebody asked me this question: are you talking flavor theory value? Like, no, like I don't know why this question comes. When me and Sunday earlier we were talking, I don't know if you saw his recent stream. He's reading Capital, so we might actually talk about that. Because I want to go back and read it because I have a bunch of economic videos I want to make about Marxist economic thought. Just as a side note. So no, not talking about that. I don't really use any Marxist economic theory, as I basically studied, like, basically all my economics are neoclassical here. Basically a little bit of Austrian stuff, but mostly neoclassical. Let's see what else we got here. Really interested in how we map. I find it really interesting how we try to map the actions of others through mathematics. And, like, have you tried to look at it from the pivot of psychoanalytics, like? So there is behavioral economics. That's like a study where you try to kind of, like, look at why people value things. The issue generally is that it's very frowned upon having, like, an overarching theory. When I said you have a utility function, you can kind of measure in various circumstances. We don't tend to assume that we can describe people's utility functions, like what people value, because these are having that is kind of like a weird theory trying to explain too much. We just kind of assume people, like, value different things and try to maximize it. People have, like, you can have different ways of looking at why people have things. You have things like, a very simple example we learned is the sunken cost fallacy. But the problem is, like, how does this manifest in behavior? And, what are the limits? Like, do people always behave in these psychologically driven ways? Do people behave in rational ways? It's very complex. This is where, like, you have to also, like, think. You have to think this is, like, here's just an example. I talk about this a lot. A guy, his name is Brian Kaplan. He wrote a book on irrationality. And basically he's an economist. He tried to, like, provide results proving that people were irrational. And the paper rejected him. It's like, oh, people aren't irrational. It's a formal assumption in economics. You can't say people are irrational. So he invented a theory called irrational rationality, where he carefully tried to, like, think about irrationality still within the frame of rationale. It's a very brilliant theory. So sometimes, like, instead of going for easy solutions, or you think, oh, all the theories are broken, try to, even though it sounds fucking ass backwards, sometimes it's just better to be more compatible with the existing ways of thinking than trying to break through. Yeah.
Here's the shitty thing too, is I think Peirce kind of flexed on him that way too with Logica U10s, which is this kind of like irrational reason. So I feel like Peirce just flexes on everyone before they can ever do anything. So my response to that is, yeah, like it's going to go into the distal end of things, right? Like it's going to go into the formative end of things. I have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to answer like a couple
answer
more,
many questions you want.
And then
Come on, guys, ask more questions. You fucking lose. Oh, President Sungay is here. Let's see.
Yeah, okay. What's he got to say? Let's see this.
Unless you want to answer another question, because I don't know if Sungay's.
There was a question I think about Marx and Hegel and like kind of Marxian phenomenology and Hegel. I think I'm gonna.
Where is that? Let me scroll up.
Because
read me the name or the timestamp. I don't really have anything to say about Marx. Marx has nothing to do really with this stream. Sorry.
That's not strictly true.
I can't find the comment either. It's so much back.
Yeah, but that's for the next stream. That's for the one on metaphysics.
Here we are. I found the comment. Here we are. I'm pulling it up on screen.
Okay.
Why isn't it letting me show?
It's showing it.
Yeah. Me and Sunday will do a Marx stream eventually. Hopefully, I asked him. Anyway, do you want to answer Sungay's question, as we call him here on my channel, Sungay?
Yeah, that's our local nickname. So basically,
why is it changing now? Fuck.
So
that's the local nickname.
To go into the Marx thing very, very briefly, though, what's going to happen there is when I look at the way in which Hegel influenced Peirce's system of metaphysics via firstness or quality or that kind of metaphysical category, then we can get into some of Marx very tangentially, but that would be for the next video on metaphysics. So that's what I'm going to leave for that. Okay, so pragmatism seems to be associated with a political orientation on almost aesthetic grounds in some brackets illiterate circles. The word pragmatic implies flexibility vis-a-vis traditions, institutions, etc. So there's a reason for that. It doesn't philosophically imply that.
Oh yeah, that's actually true.
It does imply it because it doesn't care as much about truth values or metaphysics on most accounts. And most traditional conceptions of nature, the self, reality, existence, etc., rely heavily on pre-prescribed notions about what is true, basically, a priori claims about the nature of the world, existence, etc. So basically, insofar as pragmatism doesn't strictly, in some iterations, although Peirce does bring back a metaphysics, require that, it is often associated with a more practical, pragmatic, left-leaning kind of stance. But again, it's, if you look at a pragmatist like Peirce could be read any direction politically because he's saying that we engage in all different types of inquiry. It's just that we want to get the most clear about how we come to know things. We would engage in that sort of non-authoritarian form of inquiry. So it's because it has cadences of rejecting these kind of a priori notions of metaphysical truth. That's probably why that's the case. And Sunday and I got into that a bit more when I did a previous stream with him. So yeah. What else?
I want to say something on what Sunday when Sunday said there are groups. I know the Ayn Rand Institute, for example, those kooks, they actually literally think of pragmatism as like some bad guy. Like there's literally I've seen like things by them because I like vaguely like peek at them a little bit, and they'll be like, pragmatism is a conspiracy to destroy America. Like literally.
That's hilarious because
they're almost like pragmatism is a conspiracy by the educational elite to brainwash our children to make them retarded. Like, yeah.
Well, American.
It's like one thing I read.
American thinking is pragmatic thinking. So pragmatism is basically like synonymous with American thinking, and also it's not. I don't want to get into this, but egoism and pragmatism aren't necessarily at odds either. Egoism is, quite frankly, aesthetic and boring to me. It's to some extent, but it's compatible with a lot of different systems. It's one of those things where it's like, are you considering your own outcomes optimally and, managing to develop your character in a certain way? And it's like, maybe, I don't know. And part of that might be engaging in the pragmatic maxim and thinking clearly. So egoism to me is rather dull. I'm thinking of Randian egoism in particular. It just kind of bores me. So
I'm kind of influenced by it, but I've generally moved upon it, but I still consider myself an egoist, but not a Randian or anything like that, just for clarification.
it's just taking a bunch of things that have moral or political or substantive weight and kind of aestheticizing them. So it goes almost 2/3 to where you ought to go. And then it like about faces and is like, but this is the aesthetic we ought to adopt. And this is but anybody who would commit to a certain type of life, commit to developing their character in a certain way is going to be doing it for reasons other than self-aggrandizement, simpliciter. And I know that's a really bad reading of Rand on some level, but it doesn't focus on what's important about most.
Hey, we have another question, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Would you be interested in discussing...
Rand, but I don't really give a crap about Rand.
So I was like going on and on about how I didn't give a crap about Rand. Would you be interested in discussing Heidegger and his relationship to individuality and globalism? Not at this time, because Heidegger is really far removed from what we're talking about.
Yeah. Sure. I just particularly I'm familiar a little bit with what Heidegger is, but I wouldn't consider my specialty. I believe in really focusing on. I don't think Jalma's specialty, and I'm very, very far removed from philosophy. I have like a very cursory, I read in philosophy in my spare time. Most of my interests are more in mathematics and economics. That's mostly where I'm going to direct my attention to, outside of like a little bit of other things, but. I don't think Jalma's expertise is there either. So that'd be something you'd have to prepare for. And I don't necessarily know if that's the best investment of my time. I think you might get better results with other people who are more specialized.
Sure. All I know is that his ideas about being design and like small being and capital B being kind of are a type of phenomenology that are not related to the phenomenology that fits into Peirce's scheme. Okay. I think I'm going to wrap it up now.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Great. I think I'm pretty much. I'm not going to talk about triangles when you're gone. Pretty much just let's end it here, I guess. Then, or
that's the hook.
We'll talk about triangles because there's so much to talk about on triangles, man. I want to.
Yeah.
First has the most aggravating opinions on triangles. Anyway,
I'm sure he does.
So much here. Okay, cool. Well, it's been really great to get you to sit down. I'm so glad to have you. Hope it's hard to get you, but cool.
Yeah, it's true. I'm a hot commodity.
Anything else? Any last questions? Maybe I'll stick around for a couple more minutes if you want to ask me any questions. But I'm a philosophy lightweight, so not a professional think boy.
Well, I'm not a professional math think boy, so think girl. Yeah. So I'm not really. I'm not really like a math think girl either, and so you're not a philosophy think boy, and everybody is ignorant in relation to something, and we all have the equivalent of high school education in one area, and anyway. So it's but the reality is that Peirce is flexing on all of us because he manages to really predictively determine on all kinds of things, develop systems from scratch, and generally intuit everything. So this is the reality of Peirce's genius, which we have portrayed here. It's almost like we're trying to sell the essential Peirce to people or something, but you should buy it. Okay, we're not.
Well, donate to me first. Don't buy essential Peirce. That's giving money to people I don't know. Give me money.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we would be the suppliers.
Give me money and we'll talk about more Peirce. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Give her money and it should work out. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna go, but next time we'll start with some other stuff and triangles and maybe even talk about metaphysics.
We'll start with triangles. Maybe we'll go to maybe we'll read chapter by chapter or select chapters or whatever. But I want to talk about triangles. Maybe you showed me that other stuff about it, but okay, cool. We'll talk about this next time. So
okay, it's been awesome being on stream. And
it's been awesome. Yeah, it was amazing. Hey, love you, man. It's great to have you.
All right. Okay, thank you. Talk soon.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Let me hide my dirty room. There we are. Boom. What's up to, fam? Okay. So, any more questions? The problem, let's see. Can you let me in your Discord, please? I'm Mr. J. If you join my Discord, actually, I'm a mod, so if you join my Discord, then I will, I'll just bring you in. I'll just go around President Sunday's back. Let's see, what is, maybe bisect squares so vulnerable audience members get someone. Regards to, I had some questions with regards to political ideology. Do you think centrism is anti-intellectual by nature? Well, what is centrism? That's a good question. I'm not a political scientist. That's the first thing I will say. because I'm interested in economics, a big chunk of economics is like public choice theory, which is kind of economics. You treacherous cur. So a big chunk of economics, and also what is political economy, the economic interpretation of political economy, is this thing called public choice theory, which kind of talks about kind of how people in these economic frameworks make political choices, which I kind of have a lot of interest in. So what I was talking with when I can go back to this right here. There we go. Yeah, I can go back to this right here. So in like this model right here, I had where did I put this? I had this thing called the allegorical transformation slider right here. So if I just slide this, you know, turns into different candidates. Very nifty. I just centrism. The problem is centrism is literally just the center. It's like this kind of like the middle, like half of people are on one side, half. So like it could shift. Like centrism is a complete. It's like an empirical thing. I don't think centrism is really an ideology in that sense. It's more like that's how I think of it. At least in this concept that I brought up earlier with this like median voter theorem, as like centrism is the median, like, you know, the center of half people on one side, half people on the other. That's what I kind of think of as centrism. Maybe that's incorrect. It depends what you mean by right and left as well. There's a lot of contingent things right here. I'm just kind of addressing it in kind of this game theory sense, like how we get to the center and why the center dominates policy. So let's see. Katsumi Kayota. The problem anthropology faces is very much what Heidegger spoke. Yeah, I can't really say much about Heidegger. Sorry. All right. Any more questions? What kind of treachery am I engaging in, Mr. Sunday? What are you accusing me of, man? Let's see. Is there any questions that I didn't get to that I can answer? We're still in business. Hiccups. All right. Well, if nobody else has any other questions, I can just end the stream. I'll go maybe for maybe like 2 more minutes just in case if anybody has any more questions. But I'll actually, it's a good time to I could chill for people. Like, hey, by the way, if you want, you know, behind the scenes, you know, access to oh shit, more questions. Steam Summer Ale on Europa Universalis stream. Oh man, I'm a big player of Crusader Kings. That's my game. I've never really got into Universal. Okay, more questions coming. Finally, I turned the screen and I like looked away for a second and I was like pulling up stuff at the shell. What's the biggest failure of economics? That's an interesting question. You missed 2 of mine. Which questions did I miss? Am I a joke to you? Is there like a delay? There might be a delay. That's back with the Discord thing. What question did I miss? The shape of dark. Are you talking about the shape of darkness? Like, what questions did I miss? Like, I'm confused. Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. I realized something. Oh, wait, let me bring this up, because I didn't actually miss that. Not directly bearing on the conversation here, but how do you relate economics to politics? Coming from a more economic background, I've never taken political economy formally. Well, basically, you can, I mean, like, so here's, okay, yeah, yeah, excuse me. Yeah, there's a bit of a delay. That's why I was asking, and I was like, oh, no, nothing comes in. Okay, actually, I should probably answer this a bit because somebody else answered me about this. Well, most of a lot of economics is these kind of mathematic game theory models, and so here it is. So this thing right here I talk about with gas station centrism right here, or which is kind of like one way of relating these two phenomenon. You can use economic models such as why do firms move close together, or what is prime real estate. This is just game theory essentially. So, but it's also economics as well. You're kind of looking at what are the costs and benefits for moving your location. So in here, the idea is you want to get to the close. So the optimal location is the one that is the shortest distance for the most customers to get here, but you have a competition, so you have to kind of figure it out. So. And this is a case where it's a game theory, essentially. So the equilibrium, if these two people are going, will eventually, resolve into the center, basically. That's the game theory. When you talk about that, that's the equilibrium. This is the place where all political actors will end up. Use things like that. You can also think about supply and demand, even just very crudely, if you go to vote, what is the benefit you get by voting? What is the probability your vote will impact things? And you can start to make calculations like that. Usually those calculations are very dismal and say people don't vote for any good reason, basically. Because if you think about it, what are the odds that your vote? Because if you think about it in terms of causally, what is the probability that your vote will change things? And then you multiply it by the impact of your vote, what would happen if you win and your vote changed things, and then that will be the benefit of voting as opposed to not voting. And that's a crude economic analysis you could do of you have two options, what are the what are the alternatives, what happens, but then you have to figure, okay, well, what's the benefit and cost of sitting on the couch and doing nothing or driving to the polls? Then you can kind of balance it, and then you could explain, well, the voters, they got more benefit by going to the polls. You could do a very crude thing like that. And there's some value to that in political economy. There's a really great, there's a lot of great courses you can check out on the internet on political economy. So, but I'm really into it. Definitely a lot of interesting books to read. But I come at from specifically, I'm talking about political economy, I'm mostly talking about the public choice school. More specifically, a lot of my biases are more towards people from the Virginia school, people at George Mason or something like that. Let's see. Next question. What are the biggest failures of economics? So this is a tricky question. I'm not sure how to answer. Maybe if you had some follow-ups, when you talk about the big failures of economics, there's a lot of strangeness going on here. What do we mean by economics? Are we talking about just people acting? Are we talking about the formal study of economics? I mean, there's a lot of particular issues that generally come up. Well, I was actually reading Alfred Marshall the other day, and he was talking about the classical economists and what he thought of was their biggest problem, which I slightly disagree, but I see where he's getting at. He's talking about during the classical economists, they were stressing individualism. So they went to kind of talk about markets and these voluntary interactions and everyone benefits, yada, yada, everyone has their place in society. But he didn't talk about how actions that people were doing were causing mass harm to others. And that's kind of, and this is another branch of economics called welfare analysis that people have developed to try to measure how much harm are your actions causing to others, and what are the appropriate taxes and policies that we can do economically to address that in terms of public policy thing. It's very hard to say. I mean, there's some economists that have made bad takes. A lot of people, the one problem with economics, for example, is this is an example of something that some people talk about all the time, minimum wage. What are should we raise the minimum wage? That whole conversation is so confused. And I'm trying, and is it the problem of the economist not to fully explain what are all the moving parts, or just all the moving parts too complex for people to really translate over into policy, or trying or to communicate to people, because it's not a straightforward question, even though you might see some people who say something economics says we shouldn't raise the minimum wage. Economics technically doesn't say that it's a normative statement. You'd have to make normative assumptions there. But there is various different things you could think about that might lead you into various conclusions. Economics is a very subtle thing. You kind of have to think about what do you value. Let's see right here. More questions are piling up. I'm interested in learning about economics. Can I come to you for lessons? And do you have any book recommendations? I do have. There's a really great blog that I follow. It's called Marginal Revolution. They have a special YouTube channel called Marginal Revolution University. It's very, very good. And they have another book. It's called The Principles of Economics. And it's basically run by two economists. One's Tyler Cohen, and the other one's Alex Tabarrok. They teach at George Mason, one of my favorite actual economic schools. And they actually run a really, really great education things. You can learn the principles of economics from them, all the basics. And then they have a blog where they basically just post, especially Tyler Cohen. Tyler Cohen posts basically every day tons of links. If you want to become very sharp on economics, that's a great place to start. Just sitting there and just reading all the links, reading his opinions. He interviews people. He does a lot of stuff. He's a very sharp guy. Listening to blogs, that's a good place to start. And then you'll start getting links to other blogs. That's basically the best place. I'd say it's the best place to start. At least my favorite. I think it's one of the better blogs where I kind of definitely got a lot of my interest from. There's a lot of books. DM me, get on Discord, and I can start piling books based on where you are. Let's see right here. Katsumi Kayota. No, Jaden, I have not read those. This seems like it was just to somebody else. Anthropology. Anthropology is an interesting. Yeah, there's actually even books kind of talking about anthropology and economics mixed together. There's quite a lot of interesting things. Okay, right. So it relates in a democratic the present Sunday. Did I answer your question about public choice theory adequately, hopefully? And Jaden, hit me up on Discord. Join my Discord. It should be in the description. If it doesn't work, respond to me, and then I can definitely help you out and give you some books, and I'll give you some links to the blogs that I talked about. Especially Marginal Revolution is a very great YouTube channel and also a blog as well. So, Dilvany, what new server? My Discord server, is it? It should be in my description of this video. Is it not? Just look in the description of this video. It'll be the just look for my Discord link, and if you have Discord, I don't know if you have Discord. It's basically everyone. That's basically the default platform for communicating. So you don't have a Discord, download Discord, and then visit my Discord link, basically. So, the problem though generally with so there's a lot of problems with cross methodology. There's some of the books that I've read by anthropologists trying to do economics. Some of them are very economically sophisticated, but there could definitely be some criticisms of people going in and doing economics from the outside, trying to do very similar things that economics does, mainly because economics is a very sophisticated set, and there's problems with other people going in and trying to redo things that were already done and have their own. I'm not saying being heterodox is bad, but there's also some problems if you only read heterodox. A lot of books, what's his name? He's really good. I recommend his book, David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years. Great book, but he's totally heterodox, and it's not the only economics book you should read. A lot of people, they read that, and it gives them a really interesting perspective, but it's not the entire perspective. So I'm waiting to be accepted on your server. Oh, yeah. I have a slum channel, so I'll answer that off. Any more questions? And if no more questions show up, then we'll end it then. It's been about 2 hours, so I'm pulling up my Discord, and I'm sure a bunch of people filtered in. Mr. J, dope. Yeah, I usually have like an area where you have to prove yourself to get in. So some people like don't like random people coming in. But generally I have an area where everyone can talk. Free speech, basically, zone. So you should be able to talk just in like the regular slum area, like the free speech zone and such. All right, cool. Any more questions, or we're gonna call this quits, or I'll wait a minute or two, and if I get nothing, then we'll end it then. It's getting pretty late. Zero Books. Have you heard of them? Yes, I've heard of them. I own digitally some of their books. What is it, like Four Futures? I read that a long time ago. I just can't. It's a lot of their books. Like I generally don't really think much about them. There's another book that I got. It's definitely gotten me interested in like reviewing like leftist economics claims, because like there's like definitely a big resurgence of a lot of left-wing people. Like I'm definitely a big fan of Vosh, and kind of I think he does a very good job of promoting like, you know, anarchist, like very like he's like libertarian left, I would say. I have some criticisms, especially specifically in his claims of being libertarian left, but in general I think he's very interesting. He's definitely contributing to the debate. My main, I guess, so the main thing I have with like Zero Books is that like they definitely have like their books are more just like, I like some of them are definitely smart. They just like we're like trying to advocate for like a very specific socialist viewpoint. So that's kind of the thing that I have with the Zero Books. Like they have a very specific sense of what kind of policy that they're doing. And what's that book called? People's Republic of Walmart. I read that book. I wanted to think about doing a review, but the problem is that like I just don't really. They're making a lot of interesting points, but I don't necessarily know if it proves exactly what they're claiming. I'd have to do I was thinking about doing a full review. I'm not 100% sure. It's very tricky when you do a lot of when you review a lot of leftist things, make critique of so the problem that I generally have with critiquing a lot of like leftist economic opinions is that some of them they use like very heterodox and old opinions. Like the same thing with like the labor theory of value. I generally try not to touch it, mostly because there's good reasons why people don't use it, but you can't like invalidate it. It's just like a way of analyzing a situation. There's good reasons why I can explain to you why we shouldn't use it. Have you seen any Vosh's? Yeah, I've looked at some of his debates. I want to review some of his claims on worker co-ops. That's definitely something I'm researching, and I want to do some more follow-ups to kind of look into what he's talking, if some of what these claims are on worker, what exactly his claims are. I want to like vet them and kind of actually do the proper diligence on that. I'm skeptical, but I'm totally open to it. I don't really have any particular issues with worker co-ops. The general thing with Zero Books is they have a very like explicit bias. Like, yeah, if you want to get like what is the socialist opinion on like economics and stuff like that, and like basically it's the book I talk about, People's Republic of Walmart. It's actually a really good introduction to like industrial economics, but it's like it's just giving you like the socialist take. Like there's tons of other, like I believe that there's definitely like they're making some things that I don't think are totally merited by the data, but that's of course because it's arguing for a point. So, but hopefully you get what I'm saying right there. I'm saying that like a lot of them are very smart, but they have their bias, and you shouldn't just read them. So, but I generally think their books are interesting. There's a good reason for that, in that most presumes the liberal state. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't really have any disagreements with that. I mean, there's a lot of questions about like how much markets are a creation, or how much are the economic arrangements that we take for granted as like natural. We can create these like logical ideas such as marginal analysis and do like very market like supply and demand things. But there's a lot of like critiques of like, just because we can create these logical systems, are they like always going to be historically? So you have something like the Austrians, like based like Academic Agent and the Mises Institute. They would basically say these are things that are historical. So they have logical deductions based on very similar things that match with some of our current economic predicament. And they then say this is a continuous thing, it's not historically dependent. I think I like a lot of their stuff. So don't get me wrong, like they're very crucial and very important to economics. I'm just not 100% sure if these ideas are historically contingent. You can get into that's kind of thing with anthropology. Anthropology, kind of like they're kind of like, well, let's go back and let's kind of like actually like investigate these claims. The rigid division between public and private. I think that also has a bit to do with markets in a sense, possibly because I guess, I mean, traditionally, if you didn't have the distinction between like a public and private, I mean, there'd be no. Usually these weren't formal markets. The reason why you had kind of these kind of distinctions were, and this is something that David Graeber would argue, and he talks about the state theory of money, is that he kind of points out that like historically markets kind of, in many areas, in some areas this is not totally true, but in many areas markets did arise out of a government saying, well, we want to, raise, public, we want to create an army. So they basically created, instead of like kind of saying, well, we're kind of one society, we all live together, we live in a society, everyone contributes. They would say, okay, well, here's money we're going to pay to our soldiers, and then we're going to tax them back. So you have your private activities, which will ultimately, that's just one way, I guess, in picking apart. Maybe I'm wrong what you're interpreting. I agree on why one should not. Possibly. The problem is I'm just not that very well versed in Marxist economics. I'm familiar with CVNS that's talking about capital and investments. I actually do have something interesting to say about CVNS, possibly with another book that I'm reading. There's actually a really great book that I read a while back. I still need to go through and make notes and see how I'm gonna approach this. What's the book called? Paul Cockshot. That's his name. Yeah, Paul Cockshot. it's very funny. Paul Cockshot. He's like a computer scientist and Marxist economist. His book, Towards the New Socialism. That's a really popular one where he kind of argues against the Blairite faction of the labor. Basically, it's like, screw the Blairites are bad because they're turning their back on socialism, and actually socialism is going to work and they apply Marxist economics with computer science, and they kind of work out how it's going to work in this technological age. It's kind of very popular for a lot of people. But that's basically the extent. I need to do more research on that. But that's kind of where I'm thinking about in terms of what I want to kind of address this Towards the New Socialism book. Okay, new comment from President Sunday. For clarification, the liberal state assumes the distinction between public and private because modern states derive their power, etc., from interfacing with the global economy. I'm not sure exactly what to say on that matter. What I'm curious, I guess, what I have to see from you is how kind of inverted, like a counterfactual here, kind of like how removing liberalism, like what are if you can give me some kind of like ways that you might see that specific economic changes. I'm just not 100% sure. I'm just gonna be completely honest. Like I don't exactly know right there. If there's any particular, I know you've been reading some stuff about the formation of. You talked about the internal migration from in the British Empire, specifically in India, and that's kind of come up in your video. I'm not 100% sure about that historical research. That's definitely a blind spot in my knowledge. Of course, I mean, my background is in math. And I mean, I've learned economics. I mean, I had a few courses in economics, but I didn't. Even an economics education isn't based on. It's more economic history, and political science, which is definitely something that's very much out of my reaches. This kind of like absolute sense. What's the best way I can explain it? Hopefully, I mean, maybe there would be something interesting. If you could possibly direct, maybe this could be an area of cooperation between me and you. If there's any sort of, let's see. Here's another comment from President. It's just that Marx critiques and treats as a condition of the modern state, from whereas most economics assume it. I need to read more Marx. That's part of the. I need to actually go and sit down and actually give Marx a proper. Treats and critiques the conditional the modern state, from whereas most economics assumes it. Yeah, that's. I'm not saying you're wrong. I just don't. This is part of the problem, is that if I, as I said earlier, with going after these kind of like light critiques of Marx, I don't want to do anything like that, as we've. Because of course, like there's like a lot of like nuance of what Marx's critique is, and maybe he is making a valid point. There's particular issues with some of his economic analysis that hasn't really transferred over, but I don't want to give Marx a kind of like a dismissal, because there's things. So I think like in this example, I'm talking about specifically economic claims. That's slightly different. Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see exactly. It's Let's see, what else? Would you be interested in learning more about political science ideologies in the Discord? What do you mean by political science ideologies? Do you mean like schools of political science? Or would you be interested in studying different political ideological thoughts? I mean, I'm always interested in learning about different things. I'm just saying what areas I particularly specialize in. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so definitely, if you have any particular things, I mean, just bring stuff up. And I mean, there's going to be issues where it's going to be so far out of my thing, and it might just be that just not something I feel like I could well address. But if it's something that I can spring off of my current, if there's like a path to get there, yeah, I did read Capital a long time ago, but I was young. I'm still young and naive, but I can't particularly say. I did follow David Harvey. His lectures were very useful. But well, it's not, and also just another thing on Sunday, it's not necessarily just about a collab, but like if there's any sort of like cross, thing where like you could help me like better understand something, like possibly even just a stream where we go over something that could better. I mean, I talked earlier about like I want to actually sit down and read Capital, because you said you were doing it, and I was like, that's interesting, because I want to go over and address various Marxist schemes, specifically in economics, but I'm sure, it's a broader critique of political economy. So I want to kind of delve into a lot of these things. And, if you're going to read it, then I possibly also want to read it at the same time. Yeah, so totally down for a collab, or possibly even just a stream. Yeah. David Harvey, very cool. I don't consider myself a Marxist or anything like that. That's not really part of my thought, but I should probably better understand where he's coming from. I know the basics. I kind of understand like the basics of like Marxist economics. Actually, probably a little bit more than the basics, like slightly above basic, but not like, I wouldn't say I'm like an intermediate knowledge. But even then, it's like very not even the entire of Marxist thought. Like that's just a very slim thing. Mostly just so I can read things like Paul Cockshott or something like that. But I should actually probably do my due diligence and actually sit down and read Marx properly. So, and then I can then judge, and maybe if I have any problems, I could then bring them up more. I could talk in more specificity of problems, or maybe I'll agree and then I'll become a total Marxist. It's totally possible. I'm always open. So let's see. Would you explore social and literary theory in the future? Possible if I let me highlight this comment. Would you explore social and literary theory? Yeah, possible. It just depends where we're going. I mean, if you're talking about like giving opinions on, I mean, I've made some videos on things that I've particularly philosophically interested me. I did some light talking about like some basic ideas of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, kind of like what is he setting up in the book. I did the same thing with Max Stirner, the anarchist philosopher as well. I mean, I do things that are outside of my general thing. It's partially just a matter of like time investment as well, like in terms of like making a video as well. And also kind of like what I'm interested in at the moment. I'm kind of on this economics kick. I'm sure I'm eventually going to get off of it and go focus on other crap. There's only so much to like, learn in terms of like formal learning, and then like you just basically read. And then once you kind of, got your once you've learned the basics, and you can theoretically move on to other things if that's the kind of person you are. You just want to keep on like, learning new shit all the time. But possible if you have things to share with me that wouldn't take too much. Not saying I'm not willing to put things into, but in terms of making videos, videos are a matter of, it's like literally it's a time investment. I can only invest so much time in a video before I have to like kick it out, essentially, basically. That's for the sake of like actually like putting something together. So yeah. That's the best way to explain it. But if people bring things to me, I'm totally down. I have I'm always discussing things. I mean, people on, I discuss with things with friends, like President Sunday gives me. I mean, just watching his videos, it's definitely turned me on to different books. I don't think I've really talked about anything that President Sunday has turned me on to in terms of like stuff to read, but it'll definitely have some impact in the future. So just turn me on to different things, like show me like, if there's any like lectures or anything to get me into something that you think I might be interested in. Yeah, that's the best way to explain it. Any more questions? Okay. Let me just like look away for a second. Patreon, if you want to give, links below, whatever. That's basically it. I mean, we've been going for quite a long time, so I think I'm gonna cut it off. I mean, like, I don't really care. I'll go as long as there's questions, but looks like there's not. All right. I know there's a delay, so. Oh, more questions literally just popped in. Let's see. Have you seen Contra's? I mean, like I tend to live. I think like climate change is definitely real. I think part of the problem is that I'm very skeptical that people actually. I don't remember ContraPoints' video, but I think like it was kind of making fun of like how. So I guess the character was like, "Oh man, climate change is super serious. So it's gonna, the apocalypse is coming. Like holy shit." That's like basically the thing, and everyone's like, "Oh, boring. I don't give a fuck." And like I'm very pessimistic here, and I think like a lot of people don't care. I mean, I think I've made multiple videos on like not anything serious. Like I've written like just like very like comedic videos giving takes. My ecology video, that's a short story about what if like a right wing but ecologically friendly person takes over and then runs it. So it's more of just an kind of just an experiment in like comedy, but also kind of like I don't know, kind of like weird utopia / dystopia thinking. I mean, you could interpret it as a dystopia, but I left it open. More, I don't know, that story is kind of complicated in the sense that the character who's like becomes this dictator, you know, it's kind of also modeled after Rome. Like you have a character, they become, you know, the first citizen of the American Empire, basically. And they basically have a platform of like imperialism. You know, they go around, and this is something I heard from a climate change skeptic, and this is a very interesting thought. He basically was like, well, like if climate change was so serious, why doesn't America just nuke China? Because if you think about it, like he's like, well, if you think about it, like climate change policies aren't prevented to economically cripple us. It's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma situation. That's how he put it. It's like we want to keep beating out China in terms of, you know, our economic advantage, so we have to pollute. But if that was true, then why don't we just like, he basically said, why don't we just nuke China and take them out? You know, in this kind of very barbaristic sense. But then I wonder, like, will people go for that, or will people actually say no, that's horrible? Is because theoretically that is the solution, just, you know, killing people. Sadly, I mean, it's more of an expression of how far people will go to preserve their own privilege necessarily. That's what that story is about, just to clarify. Because I write fiction in my spare time. I don't think the question can be answered easily, that people have innate sense of justice. I don't necessarily agree with that thing necessarily. I mean, I don't necessarily buy into like the whole like people are barbaric case, because I think it's a little bit more complex than that. It's more just kind of like a question more posed to you of whether you think that's plausible or not. Maybe not. Maybe it's like totally implausible and people care about justice. You know, the dignity and rights of every man. Or maybe we'll just descend into barbarism. Yeah, it's just debating co-ops or whatever. Yeah, I mean, countries competing against each other. Yeah, of course, do the nuclear winter. I mean, yeah, there's also additional problems with just nuking China in like a practical sense in terms of policy. Like, it wouldn't actually work to cause a nuclear winter. Of course, it would actually screw you over. So that actually isn't a policy solution. But still, like, genociding people is bad. Like, that's the superior answer to this. Like, but I wonder. It's just more like I wonder. Like, are people going to go? Because I think things can descend very rapidly. You never know if like climate change is actually serious. Like, what extent will policy of Western countries looking to preserve their privilege descend into kind of very barbaric aspects? That's kind of more of what I'm talking about. But so, all right. So better at pollution. Yeah, that's another thing. Pollution, you can talk about in economic analysis. That's where welfare. Now, I talked about this earlier with like welfare analysis, with trying to like determine, like measure, like harm activity, private actions that people do that harm other people, and like what are the best policies to deal with that. That's like in a school of public economics, also known as it's like a subset called welfare analysis. I'm gonna talk a little bit about that in a video that's gonna be coming up real soon. Probably sometime this week. I'm gonna post it on economic efficiency, which has to deal with this idea of do you believe in crisis capitalism? What do you mean? I think you're talking about like a Marxist I guess you're talking about the general idea that I believe it's like the idea that there's like a glut of production. I don't know if that's actually empirically true. I'm not 100%. I don't necessarily believe in that theory. I tend to, I tend to, if in terms of like why economic crises happen, I would say it's kind of a branch that studies this called macroeconomics. I don't think Marxist theories are very popular. Empirically, I don't necessarily. A lot of theories, if you look into them of Marx, even though people claim are empirically, there's some disputes on whether they are actually empirically valid. I tend to believe in like what's called real business theory, which basically looks at like basically like shocks to things. Like, okay, why did the economy? So if you look back into like 2008 or something like that, part of it was this kind of issue where you had banks overlending. So at a time, what had happened was that there was like a shock of credit. Like all of a sudden, banks were restricted in the quantity of credit they could lend out. The economy relies on this kind of flow of money, and then you have various like Keynesian. Keynes is an economist. And he kind of talks about like, well, how fast does it take for the economy to go to equilibrium? And in these kind of sense, it can cause economic downturn. So because you had this like initial like shock where you kind of had a freeze of credit, which credit is important to the economy, it causes kind of a bit of problems there in that sense. That's kind of tend to where I do. So I kind of look at shocks. I think the crisis theory is more about like gluts of production where people overproduce and they cancel. I'm not 100. Marx lays out a lot of logical arguments why it's true, but he didn't have the empirical data to back it up. And as we kind of talked about earlier, all of these logical arguments don't necessarily work out. I'd be willing, because I wouldn't say that macroeconomics is my particular specialty, because it gets even harder than doing like, because in microeconomics, you can observe individual behavior, you can test it a lot easier, but if you try to do these economy-wide phenomena, it's very, very hard to empiric, because you're dealing with like public policy. Like you can't just look like, oh, this year we're going to change the laws around and see what happens. That's why it's kind of very hard, this kind of idea of like, I believe in, oh, we just need to do this and it'll save the economy. That kind of stuff is very like, ooh, like, I mean, there's like a bit of a science to it. I mean, like basically John Keynes basically is pretty important there and a few other thinkers, but it's not, I mean, you have a few different things, like basically look at like monetary policy, look at some Keynesian stuff, but like that's generally where I tend to fall on in theory. Does not explain externalities, but lagging indicators or other tools of measurement used by economists to measure do not explain. Are you talking about like externalities in the sense that like these economic phenomena? So when you're talking about this, you're talking about like, well, externalities is generally considered a micro phenomenon. It's particular private actions are being done and they're causing an externality on the economy. But I guess about if you're talking about like Keynes, even though I said I'm talking a bit out of my league, I'm not really like macroeconomics is not my specialty. You kind of start to get out of my area of interest in terms of economics. So take this with a grain of salt, do your own reading. But the general argument would be that macro effects in the economy have effects on other people. So let's just say like you're during the Great Depression. This was like this is basically what Milton Friedman's main argument was. Basically, okay, so we have a lack of money in the economy, but prices. So for some reason, let's just say like the quantity of money in the economy falls. There's less like physical money or just money in bank accounts that can be circulated because bank closings and basically understand how banking works. But basically, there's less money in the economy, so realistically, wages should go down proportional, or they should go down a little bit closer. But what happened was that like wages didn't necessarily fall in proportion to the decrease in the money in the economy, and this caused effects where relatively it became more expensive for workers to get hired. So it was actually, in terms of like real wages for workers, they didn't like adjust while this kind of drop in money. So because there was this kind of like friction that like wages couldn't decrease, but also there was less, the money was decreasing, then you had high unemployment, because if there's less money to go around and people aren't getting paid much less, then you have these stoppages in economic activity, which cause other major effects. That's generally the reason. That's why Keynes advocated for like government spending and printing money, basically. That's the bet. But I'm not 100% sure, because I don't think externalities are generally a topic in macroeconomics. As I said, I've only done my principles course on macro. I've literally only done principles, so I can't say I've not done any investigation in any of the like tools, like people who do monetary policy. I don't really have an understanding of how people do monetary policy or various other types of, that's like the main, most people who are invested in macroeconomics do things with like the Federal Reserve, basically. That's kind of like the default thing because of monetarism and its major impact on economic thinking. So you'd have to, I've known some people who are, I've met a guy, but I don't know if I'll get him on the stream, but anyway, I'm not some area that I'm not quite as competent in, but that's basically the best answer I can give you. All right. Hopefully that was satisfying. If I don't get any more questions, then we'll end the stream. It's also getting late. It's like 9:30, so I'll get some more water. Shit. Oh shit, I probably should be reading my patron stuff. Give him a minute to deal with the lag or whatever, but oh man. Triangles. All right. Well, I think that's going to be it. I'll cut it off in like 3 minutes or so. It looks like no, I'm not getting any more questions. Okay. Well, it was a pleasure to have everyone on. We can talk more in my Discord if you have any particular questions about economics. I can try to answer them the best I can or direct you to areas. That's going to be it. These are my patrons. You can check them out. This is how I do the thing, basically, for my videos. A little programming, but cool. All right. I'll talk to you guys next time. This was a crazy-ass stream. It was. Thank you, and have a beautiful day. Folding paper model. Ugh. Okay, we'll talk more about this later. Okay, goodbye, guys. Love you all. Big hearts. Love you, cuties.